HEIDI, by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 19. The winter continues. Peter arrived punctually at school the following day. He had brought his dinner with him, for all the children who lived at a distance regularly seated themselves at midday on the tables, and resting their feet firmly on the benches, spread out their meal on their knees and so ate their dinner, while those living in Dorfli went home for theirs. Till 1 o'clock they might all do as they liked, and then school began again. When Peter had finished his lessons on the days he attended school, he went over to Uncle's to see HEIDI. When he walked into the large room at Uncle's today, HEIDI immediately rushed forward and took hold of him, for it was for Peter she had been waiting. "I've thought of something, Peter," she said hastily. "What is it?" he asked. "You must learn to read," she informed him. "I have learned," was the answer. Yes, but I mean so that you can really make use of it," continued HEIDI eagerly. "I never shall," was the prompt reply. "Nobody believes that you cannot learn, nor I either now," said HEIDI in a very decided tone of voice. "Grandmama in Frankfurt said long ago that it was not true, and she told me not to believe you." Peter looked rather taken aback at this piece of intelligence. "I will soon teach you to read, for I know how," continued HEIDI. "You must learn at once, and then you can read 1 or 2 hymns every day to grandmother." "Oh, I don't care about that," he grumbled in reply. This hard-hearted way of refusing to agree to what was right and kind, and to what HEIDI had so much at heart, aroused her anger. With flashing eyes she stood facing the boy and said threateningly, "If you won't learn as I want you to, I will tell you what will happen. You know your mother has often spoken of sending you to Frankfurt, that you may learn a lot of things, and I know where the boys there have to go to school." Clara pointed out the great house to me when we were driving together, "and they don't only go when they are boys, but have more lessons still when they are grown men. I have seen them myself, and you mustn't think they have only one kind teacher like we have. There are ever so many of them, all in the school at the same time, and they are all dressed in black, as if they were going to church, and have black hats on their heads as high as that." And HEIDI held out her hand to show their height from the floor. Peter felt a cold shudder run down his back. "And you will have to go in among all those gentlemen," continued HEIDI with increasing animation, "and when it comes to your turn you won't be able to read and will make mistakes in your spelling. Then you'll see how they'll make fun of you, even worse than Jeanette, and you ought to have seen what she was like when she was scornful." "Well, I'll learn then," said Peter, half sorrowfully and half angrily. HEIDI was instantly mollified. "That's right, then we'll begin at once," she said cheerfully, and went busily to work on the spot, dragging Peter to the table and fetching her books. Among other presents Clara had sent HEIDI a book which the latter had decided, in bed the night before, would serve capitally for teaching Peter, for it was an ABC book with rhyming lines. And now the two sat together at the table with their heads bent over the book, for the lesson had begun. Peter was made to spell out the first sentence 2 or 3 times over, for HEIDI wished him to get it correct and fluent. At last she said, "You don't seem able to get it right, but I will read it aloud to you once. When you know what it ought to be you will find it easier." And she read out, "ABC must be learnt today or the judge will call you up to pay." "I shan't go," said Peter obstinately. "Go where?" asked HEIDI. "Before the judge," he answered. "Well then make haste and learn these 3 letters, then you won't have to go." Peter went at his task again and repeated the 3 letters so many times and with such determination that she said at last, "You must know those 3 now." Seeing what an effect the first 2 lines of verse had had upon him, she thought she would prepare the ground a little for the following lessons. "Wait, and I will read you some of the next sentences," She continued, then, you will see what else there is to expect. And she began in a clear, slow voice. DEFG must run with ease or something will follow that does not please. Should HIJK now forgot disgrace is yours upon the spot. And then LM must follow at once or punished you'll be for a sorry dunce. If you knew what next awaited you you'd haste to learn NOPQ now RST be quick about or worse will follow there's little doubt. Heidi paused, for Peter was so quiet that she looked to see what he was doing. These many secret threats and hints of dreadful punishments had so affected him that he sat as if petrified and stared at Heidi with horror-stricken eyes. Her kind heart was moved at once, and she said, wishing to reassure him, you need not be afraid, Peter. Come here to me every evening, and if you learn as you have today you will at last know all your letters, and the other things won't come. But you must come regularly, not now and then as you do to school. Even if it snows it won't hurt you, Peter promised, for the trepidation he had been in had made him quite tame and docile. Lessons being finished for this day he now went home. Peter obeyed Heidi's instructions punctually, and every evening went diligently to work to learn the following letters, taking the sentences thoroughly to heart. The grandfather was frequently in the room smoking his pipe comfortably while the lesson was going on, and his face twitched occasionally as if he was overtaken with a sudden fit of merriment. Peter was often invited to stay to supper after the great exertion he had gone through, which richly compensated him for the anguish of mind he had suffered with the sentence for the day. So the winter went by, and Peter really made progress with his letters, but he went through a terrible fight each day with the sentences. He had got at last to you Heidi read out, and if you put the U for V, you'll go where you would not like to be. Peter growled, yes, but I shan't go. But he was very diligent that day, as if under the impression that someone would seize him suddenly by the collar and drag him where he would rather not go. The next evening Heidi read, if you falter at W, worst of all, look at the stick against the wall. Peter looked at the wall and said scornfully, there isn't one. Yes, but do you know what grandfather has in his box? Asked Heidi. A stick as thick almost as your arm, and if he took that out, you might well say, look at the stick on the wall. Peter knew that thick hazel stick, and immediately bent his head over the W and struggled to master it. Another day the lines ran, then comes the X for you to say or be sure you'll get no food today. Peter looked towards the cupboard where the bread and cheese were kept and said crossly, I never said that I should forget the X. That's all right. If you don't forget it we can go on to learn the next, and then you will only have one more, replied Heidi, anxious to encourage him. Peter did not quite understand, but when Heidi went on and read, and should you make a stop at Y, they'll point at you and cry, Fie, fie, all the gentlemen in Frankfurt with tall black hats on their heads, and scorn and mockery in their faces rose up before his mind's eye, and he threw himself with energy on the Y, not letting it go till at last he knew it so thoroughly that he could see what it was like even when he shut his eyes. He arrived on the following day in a somewhat lofty frame of mind, for there was now only one letter to struggle over, and when Heidi began the lesson with reading aloud, make haste with Z. If you're too slow off to the Hottentots you'll go, Peter remarked scornfully. I dare say, when no one knows even where such people live. I assure you, Peter, replied Heidi, grandfather knows all about them. Wait a second and I will run and ask him, for he is only over the way with the pastor. And she rose and ran to the door to put her words into action. But Peter cried out in a voice of agony, stop, for he already saw himself being carried off by Almunkel and the pastor and sent straight away to the Hottentots, since as yet he did not know his last letter. His cry of fear brought Heidi back. "What is the matter?" she asked in astonishment. "Nothing, come back. I am going to learn my letter," he said, stammering with fear. Heidi, however, herself wished to know where the Hottentots lived and persisted that she should ask her grandfather, but she gave in at last to Peter's despairing entreaties. She insisted on his doing something in return, and so not only had he to repeat a Z until it was so fixed in his memory that he could never forget it again, but she began teaching him to spell, and Peter really made a good start that evening. So it went on from day to day. The frost had gone and the snow was soft again, and moreover fresh snow continually fell, so that it was quite 3 weeks before Heidi could go to the grandmother again. So much the more eagerly did she pursue her teaching so that Peter might compensate for her absence by reading hymns to the old woman. One evening he walked in home after leaving Heidi, and as he entered he said, "I can do it now." "Do what, Peter?" asked his mother. "Read," he answered. "Do you really mean it? Did you hear that, grandmother?" she called out. The grandmother had heard, and was already wondering how such a thing could have come to pass. "I must read one of the hymns now. Heidi told me to," he went on to inform them. His mother hastily fetched the book, and the grandmother lay in joyful expectation, for it was so long since she had heard the good words. Peter sat down to the table and began to read. His mother sat beside him listening with surprise and exclaiming at the close of each verse, "Who would have thought it possible?" The grandmother did not speak though she followed the words he read with strained attention. It happened on the day following this that there was a reading lesson in Peter's class. When it came to his turn, the teacher said, "We must pass over Peter as usual, or will you try again once more?" "I will not say to read, but to stammer through a sentence." Peter took the book and read off 3 lines without the slightest hesitation. The teacher put down his book and stared at Peter as at some out-of-the-way and marvelous thing unseen before. At last he spoke. "Peter, some miracle has been performed upon you. Here have I been striving with unheard-of patience to teach you, and you have not hitherto been able to say your letters even. And now, just as I had made up my mind not to waste any more trouble upon you, you suddenly are able to read a consecutive sentence properly and distinctly. How has such a miracle come to pass in our days?" "It was Heidi," answered Peter. The teacher looked in astonishment towards Heidi, who was sitting innocently on her bench with no appearance of anything supernatural about her. He continued, "I have noticed a change in you altogether, Peter. Whereas formerly you often missed coming to school for a week, or even weeks at a time, you have lately not stayed away a single day. Who has wrought this change for good in you?" "It was Uncle," answered Peter. With increasing surprise the teacher looked from Peter to Heidi and back again at Peter. "We will try once more," he said cautiously. And Peter had again to show off his accomplishment by reading another 3 lines. There was no mistake about it. Peter could read. As soon as school was over the teacher went over to the pastor to tell him this piece of news, and to inform him of the happy result of Heidi's and the grandfather's combined efforts. Every evening Peter read one hymn aloud. So far he obeyed Heidi. Nothing would induce him to read a second. And indeed the grandmother never asked for it. His mother Brigitte could not get over her surprise at her son's attainment, and when the reader was in bed would often express her pleasure at it. "Now he has learned to read, there is no knowing what may be made of him yet." On one of these occasions the grandmother answered, "Yes, it is good for him to have learnt something, but I shall indeed be thankful when spring is here again and Heidi can come. They are not like the same hymns when Peter reads them. So many words seem missing, and I try to think what they ought to be and then I lose the sense. and so the hymns do not come home to my heart as when Heidi reads them. The truth was that Peter arranged to make his reading as little troublesome for himself as possible. When he came upon a word that he thought was too long or difficult in any other way, he left it out, for he decided that a word or two less in a verse, where there were so many of them, could make no difference to his grandmother, and so it came about that most of the principal words were missing in the hymns that Peter read aloud. Chapter 20. News from distant friends. It was the month of May. From every height the full fresh streams of spring were flowing down into the valley. The clear warm sunshine lay upon the mountain, which had turned green again. The last snows had disappeared and the sun had already coaxed many of the flowers to show their bright heads above the grass. Up above, the gay young wind of spring was singing through the fir trees, and shaking down the old dark needles to make room for the new bright green ones that were soon to deck out the trees in their spring finery. Higher up still the great bird went circling round in the blue ether as of old, while the golden sunshine lit up the grandfather's hut, and all the ground about it was warm and dry again so that one might sit out where one liked. Heidi was at home again on the mountain, running backwards and forwards in her accustomed way, not knowing which spot was most delightful. Now she stood still to listen to the deep, mysterious voice of the wind, as it blew down to her from the mountain summits, coming nearer and gathering strength as it came, till it broke with force against the fir trees, bending and shaking them, and seeming to shout for joy, so that she too, though blown about like a feather, felt she must join in the chorus of exulting sounds. Then she would run round again to the sunny space in front of the hut, and seating herself on the ground would peer closely into the short grass to see how many little flower cups were open or thinking of opening. She rejoiced with all the myriad little beetles and winged insects that jumped and crawled and danced in the sun, and drew in deep draughts of the spring scents that rose from the newly awakened earth, and thought the mountain was more beautiful than ever. All the tiny living creatures must be as happy as she, for it seemed to her there were little voices all round her singing and humming in joyful tones. On the mountain, from the shed at the back came the sound of sawing and chopping, and Heidi listened to it with pleasure, for it was the old familiar sound she had known from the beginning of her life up here. Suddenly she jumped up and ran round, for she must know what her grandfather was doing. In front of the shed door already stood a finished new chair, and a second was in course of construction under the grandfather's skillful hand. "Oh, I know what these are for," exclaimed Heidi in great glee. "We shall want them when they all come from Frankfurt. This one is for Grandmama, and the one you are now making is for Clara, and then, there will, I suppose, have to be another," continued Heidi with more hesitation in her voice. "Or do you think, Grandfather, that perhaps Fräulein Rottenmeier will not come with them?" "Well, I cannot say just yet," replied her grandfather, "but it will be safer to make one so that we can offer her a seat if she does." Heidi looked thoughtfully at the plain wooden chair without arms as if trying to imagine how Fräulein Rottenmeier and a chair of this sort would suit one another. After a few minutes' contemplation, "Grandfather," she said, shaking her head doubtfully, "I don't think she would be able to sit on that." "Then we will invite her on the couch with the beautiful green turf feather bed," was her grandfather's quiet rejoinder. While Heidi was pausing to consider what this might be, there approached from above a whistling, calling, and other sounds which Heidi immediately recognized. She ran out and found herself surrounded by her four-footed friends. They were apparently as pleased as she was to be among the heights again, for they leaped about and bleated for joy, pushing Heidi this way and that, each anxious to express his delight with some sign of affection. But Peter sent them flying to right and left, for he had something to give to Heidi. When he at last got up to her, he handed her a letter. "There," he exclaimed, leaving the further explanation of the matter to HEIDI herself. "Did someone give you this while you were out with the goats?" she asked, in her surprise. "No," was the answer. "Where did you get it from then?" "I found it in the dinner bag," which was true to a certain extent. The letter to HEIDI had been given him the evening before by the postman at Dorfli, and Peter had put it into his empty bag. That morning he had stuffed his bread and cheese on the top of it, and had forgotten it when he fetched Uncle's 2 goats. Only when he had finished his bread and cheese at midday and was searching in the bag for any last crumbs did he remember the letter which lay at the bottom. HEIDI read the address carefully. Then she ran back to the shed holding out her letter to her grandfather in high glee. "From Frankfurt, from Clara. Would you like to hear it?" The grandfather was ready and pleased to do so, as also Peter, who had followed HEIDI into the shed. He leant his back against the doorpost, as he felt he could follow HEIDI's reading better if firmly supported from behind, and so stood prepared to listen. "Dearest HEIDI, everything is packed and we shall start now in 2 or 3 days, as soon as Papa himself is ready to leave. He is not coming with us as he has first to go to Paris. The doctor comes every day, and as soon as he is inside the door, he cries, 'Off now as quickly as you can, off to the mountain.' He is most impatient about our going. You cannot think how much he enjoyed himself when he was with you. He has called nearly every day this winter, and each time he has come into my room and said he must tell me about everything again. And then he sits down and describes all he did with you and the grandfather, and talks of the mountains and the flowers and of the great silence up there far above all towns and the villages, and of the fresh delicious air, and often adds, 'No one can help getting well up there.' He himself is quite a different man since his visit, and looks quite young again and happy, which he had not been for a long time before. Oh, how I am looking forward to seeing everything and to being with you on the mountain, and to making the acquaintance of Peter and the goats. I shall have first to go through a 6 weeks' cure at Ragatz. This the doctor has ordered, and then we shall move up to Dorfli, and every fine day I shall be carried up the mountain in my chair and spend the day with you. Grandmama is traveling with me and will remain with me. She also is delighted at the thought of paying you a visit. But just imagine, Fräulein Rottenmeier refuses to come with us. Almost every day Grandmama says to her, 'Well, how about this Swiss journey, my worthy Rottenmeier? Pray say if you really would like to come with us.' But she always thanks Grandmama very politely and says she has quite made up her mind. I think I know what has done it." Sebastian gave such a frightful description of the mountain, of how the rocks were so overhanging and dangerous that at any minute you might fall into a crevasse, and how it was such steep climbing that you feared at every step to go slipping to the bottom, and that goats alone could make their way up without fear of being killed. She shuddered when she heard him tell of all this, and since then she has not been so enthusiastic about Switzerland as she was before. Fear has also taken possession of Toinette, and she also refuses to come. So Grandmama and I will be alone. Sebastian will go with us as far as Ragatz and then return here. I can hardly bear waiting till I see you again. Goodbye, dearest HEIDI. Grandmama sends you her best love and all good wishes. Your affectionate friend, Clara. Peter, as soon as the conclusion of the letter had been reached, left his reclining position and rushed out, twirling his stick in the air in such a reckless fashion that the frightened goats sped down the mountain before him with higher and wider leaps than usual. Peter followed at full speed, his stick still raised in air in a menacing manner as if he was longing to vent his fury on some invisible foe. This foe was indeed the prospect of the arrival of the Frankfurt visitors. the thought of whom filled him with exasperation. Heidi was so full of joyful anticipation that she determined to seize the first possible moment next day to go down and tell grandmother who was coming, and also particularly who was not coming. These details would be of great interest to her, for grandmother knew well all the persons named from Heidi's description, and had entered with deep sympathy into all that the child had told her of her life and surroundings in Frankfurt. Heidi paid her visit in the early afternoon, for she could now go alone again. The sun was bright in the heavens and the days were growing longer, and it was delightful to go racing down the mountain over the dry ground, with the brisk May wind blowing from behind, and speeding Heidi on her way a little more quickly than her legs alone would have carried her. The grandmother was no longer confined to her bed. She was back in her corner at her spinning wheel, but there was an expression on her face of mournful anxiety. Peter had come in the evening before brimful of anger and had told about the large party who were coming up from Frankfurt, and he did not know what other things might happen after that, and the old woman had not slept all night, pursued by the old thought of Heidi being taken from her. Heidi ran in, and taking her little stool immediately sat down by grandmother and began eagerly pouring out all her news, growing more excited with her pleasure as she went on. But all of a sudden she stopped short and said anxiously, "What is the matter, grandmother? Aren't you a bit pleased with what I am telling you?" "Yes, yes, of course, child, since it gives you so much pleasure," she answered, trying to look more cheerful. "But I can see all the same that something troubles you. Is it because you think after all that Fräulein Rottenmeier may come?" asked Heidi, beginning to feel anxious herself. No, it is nothing, child," said the grandmother, wishing to reassure her. "Just give me your hand that I may feel sure you are there. No doubt it would be the best thing for you. Although I feel I could scarcely survive it, I do not want anything of the best if you could scarcely survive it," said Heidi, in such a determined tone of voice that the grandmother's fears increased as she felt sure the people from Frankfurt were coming to take Heidi back with them. Since now she was well again, they naturally wished to have her with them once more, but she was anxious to hide her trouble from Heidi if possible, as the latter was so sympathetic that she might refuse perhaps to go away, and that would not be right. She sought for help, but not for long, for she knew of only one. "Heidi," she said, "there is something that would comfort me and calm my thoughts. Read me the hymn beginning, 'All things will work for good.'" Heidi found the place at once and read out in her clear young voice, "All things will work for good to those who trust in me. I come with healing on my wings, to save and set thee free." "Yes, yes, that is just what I wanted to hear," said the grandmother, and the deep expression of trouble passed from her face. Heidi looked at her thoughtfully for a minute or two and then said, "Healing means that which cures everything and makes everybody well, doesn't it, grandmother?" "Yes, that is it," replied the old woman with a nod of assent, "and we may be sure everything will come to pass according to God's good purpose. Read the verse again, that we may remember it well and not forget it again." And Heidi read the words over 2 or 3 times, for she also found pleasure in this assurance of all things being arranged for the best. When the evening came, Heidi returned home up the mountain. The stars came out overhead one by one, so bright and sparkling that each seemed to send a fresh ray of joy into her heart. She was obliged to pause continually to look up, and as the whole sky at last grew spangled with them she spoke aloud, "Yes, I understand now why we feel so happy, and are not afraid about anything, because God knows what is good and beautiful for us." And the stars with their glistening eyes continued to nod to her till she reached home, where she found her grandfather also standing and looking up at them. for they had seldom been more glorious than they were this night. Not only were the nights of this month of May so clear and bright, but the days as well. The sun rose every morning into the cloudless sky, as undimmed in its splendor as when it sank the evening before, and the grandfather would look out early and exclaim with astonishment, "This is indeed a wonderful year of sun. It will make all the shrubs and plants grow apace. You will have to see, General, that your army does not get out of hand from overfeeding." And Peter would swing his stick with an air of assurance and an expression on his face as much as to say, "See to that." So May passed, everything growing greener and greener, and then came the month of June, with a hotter sun and long light days, that brought the flowers out all over the mountain, so that every spot was bright with them and the air full of their sweet scents. This month too was drawing to its close when one day HEIDI, having finished her domestic duties, ran out with the intention of paying first a visit to the fir trees, and then going up higher to see if the bush of rock roses was yet in bloom, for its flowers were so lovely when standing open in the sun. But just as she was turning the corner of the hut, she gave such a loud cry that her grandfather came running out of the shed to see what had happened. "Grandfather, grandfather," she cried, beside herself with excitement. "Come here, look, look." The old man was by her side by this time and looked in the direction of her outstretched hand. A strange-looking procession was making its way up the mountain. In front were two men carrying a sedan chair, in which sat a girl well wrapped up in shawls. Then followed a horse, mounted by a stately-looking lady who was looking about her with great interest in talking to the guide who walked beside her. Then a reclining chair, which was being pushed up by another man, it having evidently been thought safer to send the invalid to whom it belonged up the steep path in a sedan chair. The procession wound up with a porter, with such a bundle of cloaks, shawls, and furs on his back that it rose well above his head. "Here they come, shouted HEIDI, jumping with joy, and sure enough it was the party from Frankfurt. The figures came nearer and nearer, and at last they had actually arrived. The men in front put down their burden. HEIDI rushed forward and the two children embraced each other with mutual delight. Grandmama, having also reached the top, dismounted, and gave HEIDI an affectionate greeting, before turning to the grandfather, who had meanwhile come up to welcome his guests. There was no constraint about the meeting, for they both knew each other perfectly well from hearsay and felt like old acquaintances. After the first words of greeting had been exchanged, Grandmama broke out into lively expressions of admiration. "What a magnificent residence you have, Uncle! I could hardly have believed it was so beautiful. A king might well envy you. And how well my little HEIDI looks, like a wild rose," she continued, drawing the child towards her and stroking her fresh pink cheeks. "I don't know which way to look first. It is all so lovely. What do you say to it, Clara? What do you say?" Clara was gazing round entranced. She had never imagined, much less seen, anything so beautiful. She gave vent to her delight in cries of joy. "Oh, Grandmama," she said, "I should like to remain here forever." The grandfather had meanwhile drawn up the invalid chair and spread some of the wraps over it. He now went up to Clara. "Supposing we carry the little daughter now to her accustomed chair, I think she will be more comfortable. The traveling sedan is rather hard," he said, and without waiting for anyone to help him he lifted the child in his strong arms and laid her gently down on her own couch. He then covered her over carefully and arranged her feet on the soft cushion, as if he had never done anything all his life but attend on cripples. The grandmama looked on with surprise. "My dear uncle," she exclaimed, If I knew where you had learned to nurse, I would at once send all the nurses I know to the same place that they might handle their patients in like manner. How do you come to know so much?" Uncle smiled. "I know more from experience than training," he answered. But as he spoke, the smile died away and a look of sadness passed over his face. The vision rose before him of a face of suffering that he had known long years before. The face of a man lying crippled on his couch of pain, and unable to move a limb. The man had been his captain during the fierce fighting in Sicily. He had found him lying wounded and had carried him away. And after that the captain would suffer no one else near him. And Uncle had stayed and nursed him till his sufferings ended in death. It all came back to Uncle now, and it seemed natural to him to attend on the sick Clara and to show her all those kindly attentions with which he had been once so familiar. The sky spread blue and cloudless over the hut and the fir trees, and far above over the high rocks, the gray summits of which glistened in the sun. Clara could not feast her eyes enough on all the beauty around her. "Oh Heidi, if only I could walk about with you," she said longingly. "If I could but go and look at the fir trees and at everything I know so well from your description, although I have never been here before." Heidi in response put out all her strength, and after a slight effort, managed to wheel Clara's chair quite easily round the hut to the fir trees. There they paused. Clara had never seen such trees before, with their tall, straight stems, and long thick branches growing thicker and thicker till they touched the ground. Even the grandmamma, who had followed the children, was astonished at the sight of them. She hardly knew what to admire most in these ancient trees, the lofty tops rising in their full green splendor towards the sky, or the pillar-like stems, with their straight and gigantic boughs, that spoke of such antiquity of age, of such long years during which they had looked down upon the valley below, where men came and went, and all things were continually changing, while they stood undisturbed and changeless. Heidi had now wheeled Clara onto the goat shed, and had flung open the door, so that Clara might have a full view of all that was inside. There was not much to see just now, as its indwellers were absent. Clara lamented to her grandmother that they would have to leave early before the goats came home. "I should so like to have seen Peter and his whole flock. Dear child, let us enjoy all the beautiful things that we can see, and not think about those that we cannot," Grandmamma replied as she followed the chair which Heidi was pushing further on. "Oh, the flowers!" exclaimed Clara. "Look at the bushes of red flowers, and all the nodding bluebells. Oh, if I could but get up and pick some." Heidi ran off at once and picked her a large nosegay of them. "But these are nothing, Clara," she said, laying the flowers on her lap. "If you could come up higher to where the goats are feeding, then you would indeed see something. Bushes on bushes of the red centauri, and ever so many more of the bluebell flowers, and then the bright yellow rock roses, that gleam like pure gold, and all crowding together in the one spot. And then there are others with the large leaves that grandfather calls bright eyes, and the brown ones with little round heads that smell so delicious. Oh, it is beautiful up there, and if you sit down among them you never want to get up again. Everything looks and smells so lovely." Heidi's eyes sparkled with the remembrance of what she was describing. She was longing herself to see it all again, and Clara caught her enthusiasm and looked back at her with equal longing in her soft blue eyes. "Grandmamma, do you think I could get up there? Is it possible for me to go?" she asked eagerly. "If only I could walk, climb about everywhere with you, Heidi, I am sure I could push you up. The chair goes so easily," said Heidi, and in proof of her words, she sent the chair at such a pace round the corner that it nearly went flying down the mountainside. Grandmamma, being at hand, however, stopped it in time. The grandfather, meantime, had not been idle. He had by this time put the table and extra chairs in front of the seat, so that they might all sit out here and eat the dinner that was preparing inside. The milk and the cheese were soon ready, and then the company sat down in high spirits to their midday meal. Grandmamma was enchanted, as the doctor had been, with their dining room, whence one could see far along the valley, and far over the mountains to the farthest stretch of blue sky. A light wind blew refreshingly over them as they sat at table, and the rustling of the fir trees made a festive accompaniment to the repast. I never enjoyed anything as much as this. It is really superb, cried Grandmamma 2 or 3 times over, and then suddenly in a tone of surprise, do I really see you taking a second piece of toasted cheese, Clara? There, sure enough, was a second golden-colored slice of cheese on Clara's plate. Oh, it does taste so nice, Grandmamma, better than all the dishes we have at Ragatz, replied Clara, as she continued eating with appetite. That's right, eat what you can, exclaimed Uncle. It's the mountain air which makes up for the deficiencies of the kitchen. And so the meal went on. Grandmamma and Uncle got on very well together, and their conversation became more and more lively. They were so thoroughly agreed in their opinions of men and things and the world in general that they might have been taken for old cronies. The time passed merrily, and then Grandmamma looked towards the west and said, "We must soon get ready to go. Clara, the sun is a good way down. The men will be here directly with the horse and sedan." Clara's face fell and she said beseechingly, "Oh, just another hour, Grandmamma, or 2 hours. We haven't seen inside the hut yet, or HEIDI's bed, or any of the other things. If only the day was 10 hours long." "Well, that is not possible," said Grandmamma, but she herself was anxious to see inside the hut. So they all rose from the table and Uncle wheeled Clara's chair to the door. But there they came to a standstill, for the chair was much too broad to pass through the door. Uncle, however, soon settled the difficulty by lifting Clara in his strong arms and carrying her inside. Grandmamma went all round and examined the household arrangements, and was very much amused and pleased at their orderliness and the cozy appearance of everything. "And this is your bedroom up here, HEIDI, is it not?" she asked, as without trepidation she mounted the ladder to the hayloft. "Oh, it does smell sweet. What a healthy place to sleep in." She went up to the round window and looked out, and Grandfather followed up with Clara in his arms, HEIDI springing up after them. Then they all stood and examined HEIDI's wonderful hay bed, and Grandmamma looked thoughtfully at it and drew in from time to time fragrant draughts of the hay-perfumed air, while Clara was charmed beyond words with HEIDI's sleeping apartment. "It is delightful for you up here, HEIDI. You can look from your bed straight into the sky. And then such a delicious smell all round you and outside the fir trees waving and rustling. I have never seen such a pleasant, cheerful bedroom before." Uncle looked across at the Grandmamma. "I have been thinking," he said to her, "that if you were willing to agree to it, your little granddaughter might remain up here, and I am sure she would grow stronger. You have brought up all kinds of shawls and covers with you, and we could make up a soft bed out of them. And as to the general looking after the child, you need have no fear, for I will see to that." Clara and HEIDI were as overjoyed at these words as if they were 2 birds let out of their cages, and Grandmamma's face beamed with satisfaction. "You are indeed kind, my dear uncle," she exclaimed. "You give words to the thought that was in my own mind. I was only asking myself whether a stay up here might not be the very thing she wanted. But then the trouble, the inconvenience to yourself, and you speak of nursing and looking after her as if it was a mere nothing. I thank you sincerely. I thank you from my whole heart, Uncle." and she took his hand and gave it a long and grateful shake, which he returned with a pleased expression of countenance. Uncle immediately set to work to get things ready. He carried Clara back to her chair outside, Heidi following, not knowing how to jump high enough into the air to express her contentment. Then he gathered up a whole pile of shawls and furs and said, smiling, "It is a good thing that Grandmama came up well provided for a winter's campaign. We shall be able to make good use of these. Foresight is a virtue," responded the lady, amused, "and prevents many misfortunes. If we have made the journey over your mountains without meeting with storms, winds and cloud bursts, we can only be thankful, which we are, and my provision against these disasters now comes in usefully, as you say." The two had meanwhile ascended to the hayloft and begun to prepare a bed. There were so many articles piled one over the other that when finished it looked like a regular little fortress. Grandmama passed her hand carefully over it to make sure there were no bits of hay sticking out. "If there's a bit that can come through it will," she said. The soft mattress, however, was so smooth and thick that nothing could penetrate it. Then they went down again, well satisfied, and found the children laughing and talking together and arranging all they were going to do from morning till evening as long as Clara stayed. The next question was how long she was to remain, and first Grandmama was asked, but she referred them to the grandfather, who gave it as his opinion that she ought to make the trial of the mountain air for at least a month. The children clapped their hands for joy, for they had not expected to be together for so long a time. The bearers and the horse and guide were now seen approaching. The former were sent back at once, and Grandmama prepared to mount for her return journey. "It's not saying goodbye, Grandmama," Clara called out, "for you will come up now and then and see how we are getting on, and we shall so look forward to your visits, shan't we?" Heidi, who felt that life this day had been crowded with pleasures, could only respond to Clara with another jump of joy. Grandmama being now seated on her sturdy animal, Uncle took the bridle to lead her down the steep mountain path. She begged him not to come far with her, but he insisted on seeing her safely as far as Dorfli, for the way was precipitous and not without danger for the rider. He said, Grandmama did not care to stay alone in Dorfli, and therefore decided to return to Ragatz, and thence to make excursions up the mountain from time to time. Peter came down with his goats before Uncle had returned. As soon as the animals caught sight of Heidi they all came flocking towards her, and she, as well as Clara on her couch, were soon surrounded by the goats, pushing and poking their heads one over the other, while Heidi introduced each in turn by its name to her friend Clara. It was not long before the latter had made the long-wished-for acquaintance of little Snowflake, the lively greenfinch, and the well-behaved goats belonging to Grandfather, as well as of the many others, including the Grand Turk. Peter meanwhile stood apart looking on, and casting somewhat unfriendly glances towards Clara. When the two children called out, "Good evening, Peter," he made no answer, but swung up his stick angrily, as if wanting to cut the air in two, and then ran off with his goats after him. The climax to all the beautiful things that Clara had already seen upon the mountain came at the close of the day, as she lay on the large soft bed in the hayloft, with Heidi near her. She looked out through the round open window right into the middle of the shining clusters of stars, and she exclaimed in delight, "Heidi, it's just as if we were in a high carriage and were going to drive straight into heaven." "Yes, and do you know why the stars are so happy and look down and nod to us like that?" asked Heidi. "No, why is it?" Clara asked in return. "Because they live up in heaven, and know how well God arranges everything for us, so that we need have no more fear or trouble and may be quite sure that all things will come right in the end." That's why they are so happy, and they nod to us because they want us to be happy too. But then we must never forget to pray, and to ask God to remember us when He is arranging things, so that we too may feel safe and have no anxiety about what is going to happen." The two children now sat up and said their prayers, and then Heidi put her head down on her little round arm and fell off to sleep at once. But Clara lay awake some time, for she could not get over the wonder of this new experience of being in bed up here among the stars. She had indeed seldom seen a star, for she never went outside the house at night, and the curtains at home were always drawn before the stars came out. Each time she closed her eyes she felt she must open them again to see if the two very large stars were still looking in, and nodding to her as Heidi said they did. There they were, always in the same place, and Clara felt she could not look long enough into their bright sparkling faces, until at last her eyes closed of their own accord, and it was only in her dreams that she still saw the two large friendly stars shining down upon her. Chapter 21. HOV. Life went on at grandfather's. The sun had just risen above the mountains and was shedding its first golden rays over the hut in the valley below. Uncle, as was his custom, had been standing in a quiet and devout attitude for some little while, watching the light mists gradually lifting, and the heights and valley emerging from their twilight shadows and awakening to another day. The light morning clouds overhead grew brighter and brighter, till at last the sun shone out in its full glory, and rock and wood and hill lay bathed in golden light. Uncle now stepped back into the hut and went softly up the ladder. Clara had just opened her eyes and was looking with wonder at the bright sunlight that shone through the round window and danced and sparkled about her bed. She could not at first think what she was looking at or where she was. Then she caught sight of Heidi sleeping beside her, and now she heard the grandfather's cheery voice asking her if she had slept well and was feeling rested. She assured him she was not tired, and that when she had once fallen asleep she had not opened her eyes again all night. The grandfather was satisfied at this and immediately began to attend upon her with so much gentleness and understanding that it seemed as if his chief calling had been to look after sick children. Heidi now awoke and was surprised to see Clara dressed, and already in the grandfather's arms ready to be carried down. She must be up too, and she went through her toilette with lightning-like speed. She ran down the ladder and out of the hut, and there further astonishment awaited her, for grandfather had been busy the night before after they were in bed, seeing that it was impossible to get Clara's chair through the hut door. He had taken down two of the boards at the side of the shed and made an opening large enough to admit the chair. These he left loose so that they could be taken away and put up at pleasure. He was at this moment wheeling Clara out into the sun. He left her in front of the hut while he went to look after the goats, and Heidi ran up to her friend. The fresh morning breeze blew round the children's faces, and every fresh puff brought a waft of fragrance from the fir trees. Clara drew it in with delight and lay back in her chair with an unaccustomed feeling of health and comfort. It was the first time in her life that she had been out in the open country at this early hour and felt the fresh morning breeze, and the pure mountain air was so cool and refreshing that every breath she drew was a pleasure. And then the bright sweet sun, which was not hot and sultry up here, but lay soft and warm on her hands and on the grass at her feet. Clara had not imagined that it would be like this on the mountain. "Oh Heidi, if only I could stay up here forever with you," she exclaimed happily, turning in her chair from side to side that she might drink in the air and sun from all quarters. "Now you see that it is just what I told you," replied Heidi, delighted, "that it is the most beautiful thing in the world to be up here with grandfather." The latter at that moment appeared coming from the goat shed and bringing two small foaming bowls of snow-white milk, one for Clara and one for Heidi. "That will do the little daughter good," he said, nodding to Clara. "It is from little Swan and will make her strong. To your health, child, drink it up." Clara had never tasted goat's milk before. She hesitated and smelt it before putting it to her lips, but seeing how Heidi drank hers up without hesitating, and how much she seemed to like it, Clara did the same, and drank till there was not a drop left, for she too found it delicious, tasting just as if sugar and cinnamon had been mixed with it. "Tomorrow we will drink too," said the grandfather, who had looked on with satisfaction at seeing her follow Heidi's example. Peter now arrived with the goats, and while Heidi was receiving her usual crowded morning greetings, Uncle drew Peter aside to speak to him, for the goats bleated so loudly and continuously in their wish to express their joy and affection that no one could be heard near them. "Attend to what I have to say," he said. "From today be sure you let little Swan go where she likes. She has an instinct where to find the best food for herself, and so if she wants to climb higher, you follow her, and it will do the others no harm if they go too. On no account bring her back. A little more climbing won't hurt you, and in this matter she probably knows better than you what is good for her. I want her to give as fine milk as possible. Why are you looking over there as if you wanted to eat somebody? Nobody will interfere with you, so now be off and remember what I say." Peter was accustomed to give immediate obedience to Uncle, and he marched off with his goats, but with a turn of the head and roll of the eye that showed he had some thought in reserve. The goats carried Heidi along with them a little way, which was what Peter wanted. "You will have to come with them," he called to her, "for I shall be obliged to follow little Swan." "I cannot," Heidi called back from the midst of her friends, "and I shall not be able to come for a long, long time, not as long as Clara is with me. Grandfather, however, has promised to go up the mountain with both of us one day." Heidi had now extricated herself from the goats and she ran back to Clara. Peter doubled his fists and made threatening gestures towards the invalid on her couch, and then climbed up some distance without pause until he was out of sight, for he was afraid Uncle might have seen him, and he did not care to know what Uncle might have thought of the fists. Clara and Heidi had made so many plans for themselves that they hardly knew where to begin. Heidi suggested that they should first write to Grandmama, to whom they had promised to send word every day, for Grandmama had not felt sure whether it would in the long run suit Clara's health to remain up the mountain, or if she would continue to enjoy herself there. With daily news of her granddaughter she could stay on without anxiety at Ragatz, and be ready to go to Clara at a moment's notice. "Must we go indoors to write?" asked Clara, who agreed to Heidi's proposal but did not want to move from where she was, as it was so much nicer outside. Heidi was prepared to arrange everything. She ran in and brought out her school book and writing things and her own little stool. She put her reading book and copy book on Clara's knees, to make a desk for her to write upon, and she herself took her seat on the stool and sat to the bench, and then they both began writing to Grandmama, but Clara paused after every sentence to look about her. It was too beautiful for much letter writing. The breeze had sunk a little, and now only gently fanned her face and whispered lightly through the fir trees. Little winged insects hummed and danced around her in the clear air, and a great stillness lay over the far, wide, sunny pasture lands. Lofty and silent rose the high mountain peaks above her, and below lay the whole broad valley full of quiet peace. Only now and again the call of some shepherd boy rang out through the air, and echo answered softly from the rocks. The morning passed. The children hardly knew how, and now Grandfather came with the midday bowls of steaming milk. For the little daughter, he said, was to remain out as long as there was a gleam of sun in the sky. The midday meal was set out and eaten as yesterday in the open air, Then Heidi pushed Clara's chair under the fir trees, for they had agreed to spend the afternoon under their shade and there tell each other all that had happened since Heidi left Frankfurt. If everything had gone on there as usual in a general way, there were still all kinds of particular things to tell Heidi about the various people who composed the Sesamon household, and who were also well known to Heidi. So they sat and chatted under the trees, and the more lively grew their conversation, the more loudly sang the birds overhead, as if wishing to take part in the children's gossip, which evidently pleased them. So the hours flew by, and all at once, as it seemed, the evening had come with the returning Peter, who still scowled and looked angry. "Good night, Peter," called out Heidi, as she saw he had no intention of stopping to speak. "Good night, Peter," called out Clara in a friendly voice. Peter took no notice and went surlily on with his goats, as Clara saw the grandfather leading away a little swan to milk her. She was suddenly taken with a longing for another bowlful of the fragrant milk, and waited impatiently for it. "Isn't it curious, Heidi?" she said, astonished at herself. "As long as I can remember I have only eaten because I was obliged to, and everything used to seem to taste of cod liver oil, and I was always wishing there was no need to eat or drink, and now I am longing for grandfather to bring me the milk." "Yes, I know what it feels like," replied Heidi, who remembered the many days in Frankfurt when all her food used to seem to stick in her throat. Clara, however, could not understand it. The fact was that she had never in her life before spent a whole day in the open air, much less in such high, life-giving mountain air. When grandfather at last brought her the evening milk, she drank it up so quickly that she had emptied her bowl before Heidi, and then she asked for a little more. The grandfather went inside with both the children's bowls, and when he brought them out again full he had something else to add to their supper. He had walked over that afternoon to a herdsman's house where the sweetly tasting butter was made, and had brought home a large pat, some of which he had now spread thickly on 2 good slices of bread. He stood and watched with pleasure while Clara and Heidi ate their appetizing meal with childish hunger and enjoyment. That night, when Clara lay down in her bed and prepared to watch the stars, her eyes would not keep open, and she fell asleep as soon as Heidi and slept soundly all night, a thing she never remembered having done before. The following day and the day after passed in the same pleasant fashion, and the third day there came a surprise for the children. 2 stout porters came up the mountain, each carrying a bed on his shoulders with bedding of all kinds and 2 beautiful new white coverlids. The men also had a letter with them from Grandmama, in which she said that these were for Clara and Heidi, and that Heidi in future was always to sleep in a proper bed, and when she went down to Dorfli in the winter she was to take one with her and leave the other at the hut, so that Clara might always know there was a bed ready for her when she paid a visit to the mountain. She went on to thank the children for their long letters and encouraged them to continue writing daily, so that she might be able to picture all they were doing. So the grandfather went up and threw back the hay from Heidi's bed onto the great heap, and then with his help the beds were transported to the loft. He put them close to one another so that the children might still be able to see out of the window, for he knew what pleasure they had in the light from the sun and stars. Meanwhile Grandmama down at Ragatz was rejoicing at the excellent news of the invalid which reached her daily from the mountain. Clara found the life more charming each day and could not say enough of the kindness and care which the grandfather lavished upon her, nor of Heidi's lively and amusing companionship, for the latter was more entertaining even than when in Frankfurt with her, and Clara's first thought when she woke each morning was, "Oh, how glad I am to be here still," having such fresh assurances each day that all was going well with Clara. Grandmama thought she might put off her visit to the children a little longer, for the steep ride up and down was somewhat of a fatigue to her. The grandfather seemed to feel an especial sympathy for this little invalid charge, for he tried to think of something fresh every day to help forward her recovery. He climbed up the mountain every afternoon, higher and higher each day, and came home in the evening with a large bunch of leaves which scented the air with the mingled fragrances of carnations and thyme. Even from afar, he hung it up in the goat shed, and the goats on their return were wild to get at it, for they recognized the smell. But Uncle did not go climbing after rare plants to give the goats the pleasure of eating them without any trouble of finding them. What he gathered was for little Swan alone, that she might give extra fine milk, and the effect of the extra feeding was shown in the way she flung her head in the air with ever-increasing frolicsomeness, and in the bright glow of her eye. Clara had now been on the mountain for 3 weeks. For some days past the grandfather, each morning after carrying her down, had said, "Won't the little daughter try if she can stand for a minute or two?" And Clara had made the effort in order to please him, but had clung to him as soon as her feet touched the ground, exclaiming that it hurt her so. He let her try a little longer, however, each day. It was many years since they had had such a splendid summer among the mountains. Day after day there were the same cloudless sky and brilliant sun. The flowers opened wide their fragrant blossoms, and everywhere the eye was greeted with a glow of color. And when the evening came the crimson light fell on mountain peaks and on the great snow field, till at last the sun sank in a sea of golden flame. And Heidi never tired of telling Clara of all this, for only higher up could the full glory of the colors be rightly seen, and more particularly did she dwell on the beauty of the spot on the higher slope of the mountain, where the bright golden rock roses grew in masses, and the blue flowers were in such numbers that the very grass seemed to have turned blue, while near these were whole bushes of the brown blossoms, with their delicious scent, so that you never wanted to move again when you once sat down among them. She had just been expatiating on the flowers as she sat with Clara under the fir trees one evening, and had been telling her again of the wonderful light from the evening sun, when such an irrepressible longing came over her to see it all once more that she jumped up and ran to her grandfather, who was in the shed, calling out almost before she was inside, "Grandfather, will you take us out with the goats tomorrow? Oh, it is so lovely up there now." "Very well," he answered, "but if I do, the little daughter must do something to please me. She must try her best again this evening to stand on her feet." Heidi ran back with the good news to Clara, and the latter promised to try her very best as the grandfather wished, for she looked forward immensely to the next day's excursion. Heidi was so pleased and excited that she called out to Peter as soon as she caught sight of him that evening, "Peter, Peter, we are all coming out with you tomorrow and are going to stay up there the whole day." Peter, cross as a bear, grumbled some reply, and lifted his stick to give Greenfinch a blow for no reason in particular, but Greenfinch saw the movement, and with a leap over Snowflake's back she got out of the way, and the stick only hit the air. Clara and Heidi got into their 2 fine beds that night full of delightful anticipation of the morrow. They were so full of their plans that they agreed to keep awake all night and talk over them until they might venture to get up. But their heads had no sooner touched their soft pillows than the conversation suddenly ceased, and Clara fell into a dream of an immense field, which looked the color of the sky, so thickly inlaid was it with bluebell-shaped flowers, and Heidi heard the great bird of prey calling to her from the heights above, "Come, come, come."